Along with testing for chlorine, a really important test is a test for the pH level of the pool water. pH stands for the power of hydrogen, and it's got a really key part to play in effective swimming pool water treatment. The pH scale goes from 0 to 14, with 7 being neutral. 7 is in the middle. Anything above 7 is alkaline, right the way to 14, although technically you can get substances with a higher pH level than that. And substances with a lower pH level, they're acidic. So acidic is the low side of the pH scale. And again, you can get some substances that are even lower, but generally the 1 to 14 scale works for us. So 1 through to 7 is acidic, 7 right through to 14 is alkaline. The lower the pH level, the more acidic. The higher the pH level above 7, the more alkaline. And what the key influence that pH has is on the effectiveness of the chlorine that you use to disinfect the pool. Because what happens is, if you look at this sort of segment of the whiteboard here, when you add the chlorine to swimming pool water, it's not actually, a key thing to know, it's not actually the chlorine that's the disinfectant. It's something that the chlorine sort of creates when it goes into the water and goes through certain chemical reactions. Chlorine creates something called hypochlorous acid and hypochlorite ion in different ratios depending on the level of the pH. At lower levels you get more of the hypochlorous acid being created from the chlorine, and as the pH rises you get less of the hypochlorous acid and more the other one that's created is hypochlorite ion. So the ratio between these two is directly affected by the pH value of the water. The thing is that the active disinfectant within chlorine is this, the hypochlorous acid. That's the stuff that you want. And as you can see, the higher the pH level gets, the less of that hypochlorous acid you're going to get from your chlorine. That's a big problem. If you look in this top bit here, you can see that the influence of pH is quite dramatic, because if you've got a pH level of 5, obviously far too low for swimming pools, but say you had a substance with a pH level of 5, at that level 100% of the chlorine is going to be in the form of hypochlorous acid. But look what happens to the level of hypochlorous acid you get. And remember, you've got to remember that it's the hypochlorous acid that's the disinfecting part of chlorine. Look how much of an impact the pH has on the percentage of hypochlorous acid you get, especially between 7 and 8. It's almost vertical. There's so much of a reduction in the level of hypochlorous acid that you get. So you can see that down here, you know, between 7 and 8, most of the chlorine that you add is actually going to be in the form of hypochlorite ion. You're going to get very little hypochlorous acid between a pH of 7, once the pH level gets to 8. So the problem is that most of the disinfectants used in UK swimming pools are quite high on the pH scale. Sodium hypochlorite, which is liquid, a liquid substance, that's got a very high pH level. It's got around 13 on the pH scale, whereas calcium hypochlorite, the dry chlorine, you get that either as granules or pellets. That's not as high, but still fairly high, between 10 and 11 on the pH scale. So if you're using those as disinfectants, you're going to be pushing the pH level up, and you're going to be going sort of way beyond the 8, because eventually your pool water would end up becoming pretty close to what the pH is of your disinfectant. So what generally happens is, if you're using one of these as your disinfectant, another chemical would have to be added that's quite acidic, quite low down on the pH scale. So it's usually something like carbon dioxide or sodium bisulfate, which is a dry white powder, or the liquid acids, which is hydrochloric acid or sulfuric acid, is added into the pool water to counteract these high pH levels, to get the pool water back down to somewhere between, what you're looking for is somewhere between 7.2 and 7.6, and try and get it on the lower half of that scale. So if you can, try and get your pool water to be between 7.2 and 7.4 would be even better. But 7.2 and 7.6 at the moment is the industry standard. However, some pools though, especially ones that are outdoors and they need to add something to the water to stabilise the chlorine against the UV and the sunlight, they sometimes use products that already have that acidic component called cyanuric acid already in the substance. Those are called stabilised chlorines. Trichlor is an example that's commonly used in outdoor pools. That is a disinfectant, but it just so happens to be acidic rather than alkaline. So in these types of pools, the pH correctant will actually be something that's highly alkaline rather than something that's highly acidic, because they're going to be depressing their pH level by the addition of that disinfectant. So they'd need to add another substance, usually soda ash, or sometimes it's called sodium carbonate, to push the pH level back up, because the ideal pH level, as I said, that you're aiming for is 7.2 to 7.6. If it goes lower than 7.2, you start to get problems with bathers might find it irritating, especially to the eyes, and it could cause the water to be quite corrosive. If it goes higher than 7.6 though, that's probably more of an issue. If the pH goes higher than 7.6, what it means is that your chlorine is going to be taking that pathway, and you don't want that. You don't want the chlorine to be turning into hypochlorite ion, because that's useless as a disinfectant. You want your chlorine taking that pathway. So you want to get your pH on the lower end of that scale. So every time you do a chlorine test, that's the main reason why pH is always tested for at the same time, because the other key thing to remember is that when you test for chlorine with your DPD-1 tablet, the DPD-1 test is actually on that. It's not giving you the full picture. It's not telling you how much of that is turning into hypochlorous acid. It's just giving you a figure for the chlorine. So what you might have is a free chlorine level of, let's say you've got a free chlorine level of 2, and your range to achieve for free chlorine is between 1 and 3, and you get a free chlorine reading of, on your DPD-1 tablet test, of 2. You might be happy with that. But then if you went on to test for pH and you got a pH level with your Phenol Red tablet test of 8, for example, well, I can tell you that 8, you're only going to be getting about 18% of the chlorine as hypochlorous acid. 18% of 2 is only 0.36 parts per million of chlorine, and at 0.36, that is far too low to have any sort of disinfecting ability against the levels of bacteria that you'd expect to find in a typical swimming pool. So the key message with pH is it's just as important as a test as is the DPD-1 for free chlorine. Keep it between 7.2 and 7.6, that's the industry standard range, but try and keep it, if you can, towards the lower end of that scale. So 7.2 to 7.4 would be even better to get the most bang for your buck out of your chlorine. So if you're using alkali disinfectants, you're going to be adding an acid as a pH correctant. If you happen to be using an acidic disinfectant, you're going to be using an alkali pH correctant to get your pH level up.